Hi everybody, in this video we are going to talk about how annulments of marriages work in California. Stay tuned. Hi everybody, it's Andy and welcome again to my office in Los Altos, California. I'm an attorney licensed to practice law in California as well as New York, and as I said in the intro to this video, in this video we are going to be talking about annulments of marriages in California. I guess the reason why I put this video out, or why I'm recording this video, is because for a while I was getting a lot of people who would approach me and basically ask, okay, well, Andy, I married this person, I married my wife, my husband, etc., and I guess probably the most polite way to say it is that after getting married to these people, the person who would approach me basically had discovered something unattractive about them. For example, this person was a mama's boy, let's say. This person, lied to me about their job. This person didn't tell me that they had been bankrupt before. This person really is insensitive and they don't clean up after themselves. They don't do chores, etc., etc. So there's something basically that this person discovers after marriage that had they known it before, probably would not have, they probably would not have gotten married in the first place. So it's not really buyer's remorse, necessarily, but there is some kind of similarity to it. So the basic idea is that there is something that makes this person regret getting married, and now they're trying to find a way to get out of it. So the kind of scenario that or the question they would give to me was, Andy, can I annul this marriage based on these circumstances? To discuss annulments in California, there's a concept that you have to understand called a void marriage versus a voidable marriage, which I will go ahead and write over here for you. So a void marriage is going to be under California Family Code Section 2200, and a voidable marriage is going to be under Section 2210 of the California Family Code, which I'll also write over here, hopefully, and I'll link both of those family code sections down below for you. So the easiest way to kind of explain void versus voidable, I think, is to kind of go over some of the reasons why a marriage might be void or voidable or annullable, I guess, for lack of a better word, in the first place. So some of these reasons, I think, are going to be fairly not common in terms of that they happen all the time, but common in terms of, the general population most likely has heard of them in one way or another. So I'll give you an example. So let's say that, a parent marries a child, like a father marries his daughter, let's say. I would hope that all of you kind of would realize that a marriage like that is incestuous, and by law it is not, I guess there's no scenario in which it's okay for a father to marry his daughter, for a brother to marry his sister, and so on. So an incestuous marriage like that is not okay, period, full stop. In other words, there is no scenario, no change of fact, I guess. Like, it's not like, oh, well, it's not okay for a brother and sister to get married now, but, give them a couple years and it's okay. So there is no way to make an incestuous marriage okay, I guess. So for that reason, that's an example of a void marriage. There is no way at all, period, full stop, in which a incestuous marriage is okay. It's allowed. Yeah, so void, that marriage is void, period, full stop. A voidable marriage, probably the best way to explain it would be with an example of an unsound mind scenario. So an unsound mind scenario would be if somebody gets married, but they either don't understand what's going on, they're senile, they have dementia, they have some mental condition that doesn't allow them to understand that they're entering into a marriage, what that involves, who this other person is, etc. And if that's the case, then that marriage can be voided. But the thing is, voidable, I guess the difference between voidable and void marriages is that a voidable marriage, there's a time period within which it can be voided, but if you miss it, and let's say that you are okay with it later on, you cannot go back and later on and then declare the entire marriage void, I guess, if that makes sense. So to go back to the unsound mind scenario, let's say that somebody has an unsound mind, they get married to their husband, let's say, and if they decide to get divorced right then it's something where they could possibly do an annulment because this person, the wife, for example, had an unsound mind, she didn't understand what was going on, etc. But let's say then that, instead of actually proceeding with an annulment right away, this wife decides to wait. And in particular, let's say that she decides to wait even after realizing that this marriage is not something that she agreed to initially. In other words, let's say her mental condition, her unsound mind becomes better, and then she realizes that she doesn't love this husband, she really doesn't want to owe any obligations to him, but she decides to stay even after realizing all this stuff. In that scenario, she cannot then go back to declare the entire marriage void. She's basically sort of agreed to it, I guess, for lack of a better term. She basically has, discovered the problems, discovered that this is not something that she would have agreed to initially, but then accepted it, chosen to just live with it for whatever reason. So in that scenario, because she's deemed to have accepted kind of the marriage that she's sort of entered into, if she then wants to end the marriage, she can, but it's going to be through a regular divorce dissolution sort of process. Hopefully all of that made sense. This is not a kind of normal thing that I think most lay people think about. The reason why this void versus voidable marriage kind of distinction is important is because under the void scenario, there are no community property rights that result, for instance. So the marriage, like I said, a void marriage rather, void from the outset, there's no way in which that marriage is legal ever at all. So no community property rights exist, and it's like the marriage never legally sort of happened. A voidable marriage, however, is slightly different because let's say that, back to the unsound mind scenario, let's say that this wife discovers all these bad, problems, I guess, with her marriage, that she would never have agreed to this. If she wants to get a annulment at that point, void the entire thing, sure, she can, and there's going to be no community property rights that result. However, let's say that she doesn't get an annulment right away and she basically accepts or kind of continues to live with the fact that this marriage is not something she would have agreed to. If she does that, the marriage then becomes voidable. She can end it through a divorce process, but there will be a period of time within which a community property right, for example, does actually exist. So, hopefully that made sense. For bigamy, that's actually, there's a special exception for bigamy also, relating to whether or not you had a belief that the prior spouse was deceased. There's a 5-year rule, for example. But that's the basic idea, void versus voidable. That's a very important distinction to actually understand, to make. So anyway, hopefully all of that made sense, but void versus voidable, that's the first thing you have to understand when you are talking about an annulment in California. So to go over some kind of basic reasons why an annulment might happen, incest I've mentioned already, unsound mind, for example, I've mentioned already, bigamy I've mentioned a little bit also, force, if somebody's forcing another person into a marriage, if they are physically unable to kind of participate in a marriage, all of that stuff can be grounds for an annulment. The more common one, which is kind of leads back to what I said earlier about people coming to me and saying, "Hey, Andy, I didn't realize this about her. I didn't realize this about him. Is this fraud? Basically, is this fraud that allows me to get an annulment, so then I can not have to pay alimony, I don't have to split property, so that for religious reasons I can say that I've never been married, and so on." So the question then becomes: is fraud sufficient, is this, my scenario, sufficient to constitute fraud for the purposes of annulment? And I guess to kind of generalize, if it's something where, let's say that, you're saying, oh, well, she didn't tell me that she was a shopaholic. He didn't tell me that he was a slob. He didn't tell me that he would never go work. Is that sufficient to constitute fraud? In general, unfortunately, the answer is no. California, the rule for fraud, I guess, the criteria for fraud in California is basically that it has to go to the substance of the marriage, the essence, kind of why you get married in the first place. And I'm going to cite to a case which I'll link down below with the citation. It's called Meagher and Malecki. It's a 2005 Court of Appeals case. And that one basically goes over, this rule that, whatever fraud you claim in an annulment situation has to go to the essence, the very reason why you got married in the first place. So I'll give you some examples that actually have qualified as fraud, sufficient to, grant an annulment before. So one thing would be, let's say that you are impotent, for example, like your spouse didn't tell you that he or she was impotent, or that he or she could not bear children, for example, or that he or she would refuse, I guess, to live with you. So the thing is, spouses, it's sort of assumed that, once they get married, they're going to live together, they're going to have sexual relations, they're most likely going to, bear some or become parents to children, etc. All of that stuff is kind of essential, I guess, under the Meter and Malecki rule, that it's the essence of the marriage, and therefore, if that stuff is not disclosed or that stuff is lied about in some way initially, that's fraud. You can get an annulment for that reason. I'll also give you another scenario, which unfortunately is more common than I would like to kind of think, or that I would have ever thought, I guess. Particularly on the West Coast, if you are actually not on the West Coast of the United States, then leave me a comment down below, I guess, and tell me whether or not this scenario is actually fairly common where you live as well. But the scenario that I'm referring to basically is immigration fraud. So let's say, for instance, that I'll generalize quite a bit here, but let's say that, on the West Coast of the United States, you have some man who's been married before, but, he's gotten divorced, he's in his, say, mid-50s or something, and, he goes overseas to China, Vietnam, whatever, and, basically marries some woman who's much, much younger than him. And he, falls in love with her head over heels. He decides to bring her back to the United States on a, K visa, for example, a fiance visa. He brings her back, he marries her, she gets a conditional green card. And then as soon as the 2-year period passes for a conditional green card and, her green card becomes legal, she basically says, oh, hey, sorry, I'm leaving you. Like literally the day that she gets her green card, she decides to leave. That type of scenario, basically, I'm hoping you guys can see, is she married this guy just to get a green card. That type of marriage can be annulled also because, this person from overseas never really intended to be a spouse, I guess, never intended to live with you, never intended to have sexual relations with you, never intended to, bear children with you, etc. Her sole purpose in this example, this is not gender specific, guys can do this too, but in my example, this person from overseas, the sole reason why they got married was to come to the US, get a green card, and as soon as he or she got the green card, boom, she's gone. So immigration frauds kind of scenarios like that are actually fairly common also. So I don't have a video on immigration stuff that I just mentioned, like, the K visa, the conditional green card, and so on. If you are interested in something like that, go ahead and leave me a comment. I'm always taking suggestions for what new videos to put out. So those are some scenarios that basically work, I guess, for annulments. They're not guaranteed, but there are cases that basically go over each of those scenarios that I mentioned that said, yes, this is sufficient fraud to grant a annulment. So I'll give you some examples of stuff that does not work. So if, let's say that you get married to a guy and he didn't disclose, I guess, that he had gone bankrupt before. He didn't disclose that he had a criminal record before, that he'd been in prison before, let's say. He didn't disclose that he was an alcoholic. He didn't disclose that he was poor, for example, or that he had no money, and maybe he hid that from you. Maybe you just never bothered to ask. I don't know. But wealth, I guess, if there's like a misrepresentation about wealth, not enough. Misrepresentation about criminal record, not enough. Alcoholism, not enough. So I guess hopefully all of that made sense. Like the void versus voidable thing, that's actually pretty important to understand when it comes to discussing annulments in California. In general, I guess the people that I have dealt with, at least, they basically want to take a broader reading of fraud, include more things under fraud than the cases in California really allow. So, like I said, unable to have children, unwilling to live with you, immigration fraud, for instance. All of that stuff, there are cases that basically hold that is sufficient fraud. But merely like basically having buyer's remorse over the fact that your new husband's an alcoholic, your new wife, basically spends money like there's no tomorrow. All of that stuff, unfortunately, is not sufficient to constitute an annulment, like to grant an annulment. However, it is something where, you can always go through a normal divorce. The problem, I guess, and I use that word problem kind of literally, or sorry, liberally rather, liberally here. If you go through a normal divorce process, then of course, you will have community property rights that you have to basically deal with. So if you go through an annulment, the reason why people want to do that is because depending on whether or not it's void versus voidable, you either have no community property rights at all, or you have very, very little ones, I guess, or a very small period, hopefully. So, yeah, I guess that's basically it. Like, that's, annulments in California in a nutshell. Again, hopefully that helped. Not too confusing. Go ahead and comment, share, like, subscribe, all that social media stuff that young people do now. And I will talk to you guys next time. Thanks.